The runway lights were visible. The runway wasn't. I stood in the control tower with one hand on the sill beneath the window, feeling static prickle over my knuckles hard enough to raise the hair on my wrist through 2 layers of cold weather gear. Outside, the night should have been simple. Black tundra, drifting snow, the flat white skin of the world reflecting whatever moonlight managed to get through the cloud cover. Instead, I watched a clean line of approach lights burn through the dark in perfect spacing, red and white and steady, reaching toward us from a point that didn't exist. I knew the charts. I knew the survey map tacked to the wall beside the weatherboard. Beyond the last confirmed stretch of runway, there should have been frozen ground, a shallow grade, and then nothing but open distance all the way to Broken Rock. But the lights kept going. The radio gave one dry hiss. Then the landing beacon kicked on overhead with a metallic thunk that I hadn't touched, and the whole tower shivered as if something deep under the frost had answered it. I checked the radar screen. Blank. No transponder. No return. No weather clutter. Nothing. Then, far out where the lights vanished into black, I saw 2 pale landing lamps descending through the dark, level and deliberate, coming in toward a runway the maps said wasn't there. I couldn't hear engines. I couldn't hear wind either. For 3 full seconds the Arctic went absolutely silent, like the whole world had put its hand over my mouth. Then the radio crackled, and a man's voice I hadn't heard before said, very calmly, "If you're seeing the long approach, don't let it make you curious. That's how it starts." The transmission cut out, and all I could think was, why had Henri Beaulieu left rules instead of a report? That was 6 nights into the job. When I took the contract, I thought it was generator work, lighting maintenance, and maybe some instrument calibration if the weather cooperated. The posting had been thin on detail and rich on hazard pay, which wasn't unusual for northern work. Remote sites were always like that. People in the south heard Arctic and imagined adventure. Contractors heard Arctic and imagined delay, corrosion, frozen lines, and equipment that only chose to fail when the temperature got low enough to kill you before the repair was finished. I was an outside man. That was what they wanted. Not a career airfield operator, not a local, not someone with family anywhere near Nunavut who'd ask too many questions if communication got spotty. I handled neglected infrastructure in bad places, the kind of temporary assignment where a company needed somebody competent enough to make a dying facility functional and detached enough not to care why it had been allowed to die in the first place. The approval came back fast. Too fast. I remembered that now more often than I wanted to. At the time, I only saw a decent rate 6 weeks on site, emergency aviation support near the Boothia Peninsula, and a list of aging systems that matched the kind of work I'd done across northern strips, weather stations, and mining routes. The flight north was rough, not because of turbulence but because of scale. Once you got past the usual lines on the map and started seeing the land for what it actually was, all the distances stopped feeling abstract. The ice looked endless. The rock looked old enough to resent being noticed. Even from the air, the place felt unwelcoming in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. Ainsley Ruth Mercer was the one who flew me in. I didn't know her name mattered yet. She landed the supply plane so smoothly I barely felt the wheels touch, then taxied without speaking toward a strip that looked older than its paperwork. When I climbed out, the cold found the gap at my collar immediately. The air tasted metallic. Under that, faint and wrong, I caught the smell of wet stone, like fresh rain on a basement floor. It was well below freezing. I remember standing there with my duffel in one hand and thinking the smell had to be fuel runoff or thaw trapped under the gravel bed. That detail seemed minor then. I carried it for the rest of my life. The airfield consisted of one narrow runway, a squat hangar, a fuel shed, a maintenance shop, and a control tower that looked less like an aviation structure than a watch post someone had justified with paperwork. Everything was functional in the bare minimum sense. The paint had gone chalky. The metal doors complained when moved. Frost had feathered the inside corners of the tower windows where the insulation had lost the fight years ago. There should have been another man there to hand the site over. The posting had listed a caretaker whose health had required relief coverage. Instead, there was an office key taped beneath the radio console and a typed note on the desk that read, "Equipment mostly operational. Inventory current. Stay on weather logs." The signature line was blank. Most of the previous caretaker's things were still there. That was the first detail that bothered me in a professional way, not a superstitious one. If a man left a remote posting under medical leave or emergency extraction, maybe he forgot a book, a jacket, a half carton of canned soup. He didn't leave spare boots by the door with the laces still tucked. He didn't leave 2 neatly folded sweaters in a drawer. He didn't leave a shaving kit with the cap off the toothpaste. Henri-Luc Beaulieu had left the place as if he'd stepped out to check a breaker and simply failed to return. I found his name on maintenance stickers, weather logs, handwritten notes about fuel variants and light checks. His handwriting was compact and controlled, French shaped by years of writing in block capitals for other people's systems. There was nothing dramatic in it. No final message scratched into a desk. No blood. No obvious sign of accident. Just absence, laid over routine. By the end of the first day, I had the generators open, the runway edge light circuit tested, and the tower heater making a sound I didn't trust but couldn't improve without parts. Toward evening, I went looking for backup fuses in the maintenance shop. The place smelled of dust, diesel, and old plywood. One locker was padlocked. The key ring from the office opened everything else. Not that one. I should have left it alone. Instead, I cut the corroded shackle because that was my job. Inventory access. Site recovery. Nothing mysterious about it. Inside the locker, there were no tools. Just a parka hanging on one hook, a box of weather forms, and a black notebook wrapped in a freezer bag. On top of it, in careful block letters, Henri had written my replacement will need this more than management ever will. I took it back to the office and read it with the heater ticking and the evening light thinning against the windows. There were 7 rules, each written on its own page in the same deliberate hand. If the runway appears longer than usual, do not measure it. Never follow landing lights beyond marker 7. If an aircraft lands without appearing on radar, do not approach it. Record every weather change, even impossible ones. When the control tower clock gains time, stay indoors. Do not answer radio calls from Henri Beaulieu. If the northern lights appear beneath the horizon, leave the airfield immediately. That was all. No explanation, no dates, no rationale. Just those 7 lines, copied as if precision mattered more than meaning. I sat there with the notebook open on my lap and listened to the wind scrape powder snow over the tower siding. The paper felt dry and cold against my thumb. I told myself what any competent contractor would have told himself. The previous caretaker had cracked under isolation. He'd built rituals around glitches, weather, and the kind of sensory distortion that came from too much darkness and not enough company. The rules weren't a warning. They were residue. Even then, I knew that wasn't the whole truth. Because men who were losing their grip didn't usually hide their delusions in a maintenance locker with a note for the next man. They left them in plain sight. The next morning, I started on the runway checks. In a place that isolated, you learned quickly that a strip wasn't a strip. It was drainage, grade, heat transfer, light spacing, snow behavior, line visibility, and a dozen systems nobody noticed until one of them slipped half an inch out of tolerance and turned a landing into an obituary. The wind was steady from the northwest, low and hard. It had that clean knife quality dry cold always had up there. Every breath burned a little. Every exposed bit of skin felt overbright, like the air itself carried charge. By noon I'd checked the first set of threshold lights, cleared a drift at the western end, and recalibrated a damaged marker sensor that had been reading dead. The runway looked ordinary. Narrow, weathered, patched where frost heave had done what frost heave always did. But when I made the return walk to the tower, something in the perspective caught me wrong. The far end seemed farther away. Not in any dramatic way. Not the kind of thing a sane person noticed once and panicked over. It looked like what a road looked like after a long drive, when the eye had spent too many hours trying to judge distance across open country and started losing confidence in itself. I stopped, squinted against the glare, and checked the survey stakes. The numbers matched the map. At least they did that afternoon. I told myself fatigue was doing what fatigue did. White ground, low contrast, no vertical reference, and a horizon so wide it robbed scale from everything inside it. Still, Henry's first rule came back to me hard enough that I actually laughed under my breath. If the runway appears longer than usual, do not measure it. That wasn't how my brain worked. If a thing looked wrong, you measured it. You trusted the result more than the eye. That's why roads got built, planes got landed, and men in remote towers didn't drift into folklore. So I measured. Not formally. I wasn't stupid enough to drag a full tape into wind like that when the site already had marker intervals and survey references. I checked the published length against the light spacing, then paced the center line between confirmed points, then used my handheld GPS to compare distance from threshold to marker. The GPS gave me one number on the walk out and another number on the walk back. I reset it. Tried again. Different again. The discrepancy wasn't huge, but it wasn't random either. It was like the unit couldn't decide where I was standing. I tested satellite lock. Good. Battery. Good. I checked the marker posts. One of them looked a little farther east than it had an hour before, but that was impossible, so I blamed the light. I spent the next 2 days trying not to blame the light. Every inspection showed the same problem in a slightly different form. The runway never looked wrong at first glance. It only felt wrong once I was on it. The intervals between markers seemed to stretch and tighten. The approach lights at dusk appeared just a little too numerous, like I'd misremembered the count by 1 and then by 2. A cracked patch in the asphalt that should have lain 3 paces past a drainage grate turned up before it one morning, and after it the next. My maps stayed the same. My instruments didn't agree with each other long enough to be useful. The land around the strip began to bother me too. There were low survey stakes out on the frozen ground beyond the runway shoulders, old painted posts driven into gravel and permafrost for grading reference. I knew where I'd seen them on arrival. By the 4th day, I could have sworn one had shifted several feet north. Another vanished entirely until I found it at sunset, half buried in drift on the opposite side of the service track. I checked for prank wires. Loose ground. Snow movement. Nothing. The silence started then. Not the usual Arctic quiet. I was used to that. Remote work taught you to hear layers in what other people called emptiness. Wind across corrugation. Snow hiss over packed ice. A distant engine note carrying miles farther than it should. The silence at the airfield was different. It came in brief, unnatural cuts, as if the world had missed a beat. I'd be standing beside the fuel shed with the wind pushing at my hood. Then all at once there'd be nothing. No rush of air. No rattle from the loose gutter on the hangar. No faint generator hum from the buried utility trench. Nothing. 3 seconds. Maybe 4. Then sound came back at once, making me flinch every time. On the 5th day, I went out with a proper measuring wheel and a clipboard because irritation had finally beaten caution. The sky was clear, the light flat and honest, the kind surveyors prayed for. I marked my starting point at the west threshold and began pushing the wheel along the center line, eyes down, recording distances against known markers. By the time I reached the midpoint, the hairs on my face and hands were lifting with static. The dry cold should have suppressed any smell at all, but wet stone drifted up through the ground strong enough to taste. The wheel skipped once on a seam. I corrected. When I looked up, marker 5 appeared farther away than it should have been, but not by a fixed amount. It was like the space between us had gone soft. I stopped. The wheel counter clicked once on its own. That was when I noticed the prints behind me. My own boot marks were there, fresh and clean in the drift across the center line. But the intervals between them were wrong. At the start, they matched my stride. 10 steps back, they were wider. 20 steps back, they looked like a taller man had made them. By the threshold, they had stretched so far apart that I would have had to be leaping. I left the wheel where it was and walked straight back to the tower without turning around. The static followed me all the way to the door. At the time, I called it a refraction effect, the kind of optical distortion cold air sometimes caused over snow. I said that out loud, alone in the tower, because hearing an explanation spoken made it feel sturdier. I didn't understand yet that the rule hadn't been about obsession. It had been about participation. The afternoon the tower clock gained 17 minutes. The sky was clear enough to hurt your eyes. No storm front. No electrical interference that should have done more than tickle the radio. I remember that because I was halfway through a weather entry and annoyed at how ordinary everything looked. The place had a way of humiliating your instincts. Just when you got yourself braced for something genuinely wrong, it handed you a perfect blue day and made you feel melodramatic for noticing anything at all. I had the anemometer readings logged, ceiling estimated, visibility functionally unlimited, and I was cross-checking the outside temperature against the backup sensor because the primary had started drifting low. The heater clicked. The tower window creaked. My pen scratched over the page. Then I glanced at the wall clock. It was 17 minutes ahead of my wristwatch. I checked the battery backup clock on the radio console. 17 minutes ahead. Every system in the tower that kept time had jumped by the same amount. For a few seconds I did nothing. The air on my face felt charged, like I was standing too close to old cathode equipment. Then Henry's fifth rule moved through my head in his flat, careful handwriting. When the control tower clock gains time, stay indoors. I closed the weather log. I locked the tower door even though there was no one for miles. Then I stood very still and listened. Outside, the wind died completely. The silence pressed against the glass. I stayed inside for nearly an hour, telling myself I was respecting an electrical anomaly until the instruments stabilized. The clock never lost the 17 minutes. It carried them from then on, as if the tower had simply decided to live a little ahead of the rest of the world. At dusk, the radio interrupted a standard weather relay from a southern station. The broadcast stuttered, dragged into static, and then a man's voice came through clear enough to make me straighten in my chair. "Control tower's heater is still knocking on the left side panel," he said. "You won't fix it with a wrench. Kick the housing once. Low, not high." I stared at the speaker. The voice continued, calm and mildly tired. The tone of a man passing on a routine detail to someone covering his shift. "And the drainage grate by marker 3 is icing from below, not above. If you chip from the surface you'll crack the edge light conduit." My mouth had gone dry. I looked at the notebook on the desk. Rule 6 seemed to watch me from the page. "Do not answer radio calls from Henri Beaulieu." I should have switched frequency. I should have cut power to the set and walked away. Instead, I reached for the microphone and stopped an inch short. "Who is this?" I said aloud to an empty room, not keyed, not transmitted, because I still wanted the comfort of believing in a recording. Then the voice answered the question I hadn't asked over the air. "It's colder in your tower than it was in mine," he said. "That means you've got less time than I did." The line erupted in static so sharp it made me jerk back. When it cleared, the weather relay had resumed mid-sentence as if nothing had interrupted it. I went down to the heater housing with a flashlight and a screwdriver I didn't need. The metal casing was cold enough to sting through gloves. I kicked the lower left panel once. The knocking stopped. I just stood there in the dim service room with the smell of diesel and hot dust around me, listening to the silence inside the walls. I told myself it could still be trickery. A recorded message from the missing caretaker keyed by some frequency overlap. A delayed tape. A prank built by loneliness and bad infrastructure. Then I checked the drainage grate by marker 3. Ice was blooming up through the seam from underneath. That night I didn't sleep much. Every time the wind went still, I opened my eyes. Every time the radio hissed in its cradle, my heart picked up before my brain had a chance to argue with it. I began noticing little operational details that no one outside the site should have known. A relay I hadn't documented yet. A cabinet hinge I'd oiled that morning. The fact that I preferred the secondary weather forms because Henry's block print crowded the official ones less. He came over the radio again just before dawn. Not words at first. Breathing. Faint, steady, close enough that I could hear the dryness in it. Then, very softly, "Don't let the long runway teach you your own name back." I didn't answer. Looking back, that was the last moment I could have kept treating the notebook like evidence of a damaged mind. After that, every decision I made happened inside the possibility that Henri Beaulieu had not vanished in any way I understood. The first time I went to marker 7 at night, I told myself I was only checking a light fault. One of the far runway markers had begun pulsing irregularly after sunset. Not failed, not fully dimmed, just out of rhythm enough that any incoming pilot would have complained. I bundled up, took a maintenance kit, and drove the small utility vehicle out along the service edge, while the beam from the mounted lamp bounced over frozen gravel. The tower shrank behind me, a square of weak yellow against the dark. Beyond it, the land looked erased. The closer I got to the outer markers, the more the air changed. The cold didn't deepen exactly. It thinned. That's the best word I had for it. My breath felt too loud in my hood. Static crawled over the backs of my hands every time I touched metal. And underneath the clean bite of snow and fuel, that smell returned, wet stone rising from ground that should have been locked solid. Marker 7 stood where it was supposed to, a short post with its lamp hooded against wind and a frost rind building on the windward side. I cut the vehicle motor and stepped out with my flashlight. The moment the engine noise died, so did the wind. Absolute silence. I remember the click of the flashlight switch sounding indecently loud. Henry's second rule had been specific. Never follow landing lights beyond marker 7. I hadn't intended to. I only meant to replace the bulb and head back. Then I looked up. The runway continued. Not as illusion. Not as a trick of darkness. Past marker 7. The edge lights kept going in perfect alignment, stretching out over black ground far beyond the documented end of the strip. At first I thought I was seeing reflected stars. But no. These were airfield lights, spaced with intent. Red, white, amber. A whole continuation of infrastructure laid out over a place where no infrastructure should have existed. My flashlight beam reached only a short distance into the dark, but the runway beyond swallowed it and gave me its own geometry in return. I stood there with the toolkit hanging from one hand and felt my stomach tighten in a way fear rarely managed anymore. Fear in industrial work was usually immediate and technical. Falling ice, live current, bad footing over a fuel trench. This was worse because it asked nothing of my training. It only asked that I notice. The extended lights didn't run straight forever. After a distance I couldn't judge, they curved slightly left, following a grade the known runway didn't have. Beyond that curve I saw structures. At least I thought I did. Low rectangles with tower silhouettes behind them. Dim-lit windows. A rotating beacon making one slow sweep through darkness and then disappearing. They sat far enough away that scale became uncertain. They might have been buildings. They might have been reflections. They might have been a second airfield laid over the first like a tracing error in the world. My skin began to sting under my gloves. Then I heard something that made me step back at once. A vehicle door slammed in the distance. Not near me. Far down the impossible stretch beyond marker 7. A clean metallic crack, followed by what could have been footsteps on crusted snow. I shut off my flashlight. Instinct. If someone was out there, I didn't want to be seen before I understood what I was looking at. In the sudden dark, the extended runway seemed brighter, as if it had been waiting for my light to stop competing with it. Another sound carried back. A voice over a public address speaker, too far away for words, speaking in the clipped cadence of tower procedure. My mouth had gone numb from cold and something else. I backed toward the vehicle without taking my eyes off the lights. Halfway there, I realized the marker lamp I had come to fix was steady again. It had never failed. Or if it had, whatever lay beyond 7 had corrected it for me. I got in, started the engine, and drove back faster than I should have on that surface. In the mirrors, the normal runway ended where it always had. I did not go beyond marker 7. I didn't need to. The place beyond it had already done what it meant to do. It had shown me there was more airfield out there than the maps allowed, and it had shown me just enough of it to make the ordinary parts of my job feel temporary. The next morning I checked the official site boundary markers with daylight on my side. No extension, no structures, just the runway, the graded overrun, frozen rock, and distance. The lamp at marker 7 tested clean. No sign of failure. I almost convinced myself I'd wandered into a night distortion built from static, cold, and too much time alone. Then I found a second set of tire tracks. They started near marker 7 and went out past the documented end of the runway until they reached bare tundra. Then they stopped, not because the driver turned around, but because the tracks simply ceased. The snow ahead of them was untouched. The first supply run after that came in under a low gray ceiling with fine dry snow moving sideways across the strip. I heard the aircraft long before I saw it, which felt reassuring in a way I hadn't expected. Engine noise meant ordinary physics. It meant a machine from the known world crossing predictable distance toward a known point. By the time the plane touched down, I had the lights verified, the fuel log ready, and the old discomfort pressed back behind procedure where I liked it. Ainsley Ruth Mercer climbed down from the cockpit in a weathered flight jacket and looked at me like she was checking for damage rather than greeting a man. She was lean, gray at the temples, and moved with the controlled economy of someone who had spent years doing dangerous work without ever calling it that. The cold didn't seem to reach her the same way it reached other people. She took one look at the tower, one look at the west end of the runway, and then asked, "Did they leave you a notebook?" I hadn't told anyone about the rules. The smell of jet fuel hung sharp in the air between us. Snow hissed over the tarmac. I said, "Why would I have a notebook?" She looked past me toward the hangar. Because Henri wasn't careless. That was the first time I heard another person say his name without lowering their voice. I brought her inside while the ground transfer heater ran. She didn't ask permission before taking the notebook from my desk. She flipped through it like a woman checking a familiar manual for missing pages, then nodded once to herself and handed it back. "You've read them," she said. "I've read enough to know none of this was in the contract." "No," she said. "It never is." There was no disbelief in her. No polite patience reserved for isolated workers who'd started seeing patterns in weather. That unsettled me more than any radio transmission had. I asked her how long she'd known Henri. Long enough. Long enough wasn't an answer. She knew that. She was bargaining even then. Not with me. With the conversation. Giving one fact so she wouldn't have to give three. When I pressed, she finally said she'd been flying supplies to that field for nearly 20 years. Not continuously. Not on some romantic frozen frontier schedule. Just often enough to outlast a pattern. She'd seen caretakers come and go. Some left early. Some finished their contracts. Some stopped answering the radio and were replaced on paper before the paperwork had time to settle. Several disappeared, she said, watching snow gather in the corner of the tower window frame. None of them under ordinary circumstances. My mouth felt dry again. And management keeps the place open. They keep the lights funded, she said. That's not the same thing. We unloaded in near silence after that. She knew the site better than some full-time operators I'd worked with. She set crates exactly where they belonged without checking labels. She avoided one section of the hangar apron without ever mentioning it. While I was signing the fuel receipt, she glanced at the employment packet I'd left on the desk, and her expression changed in a way I couldn't read. "Where'd you get this copy?" she asked. "The office printer. Look at the authorization page." I did. The contract approval carried a signature stamp from regional operations. The date beneath it was 3 weeks before the posting had officially been advertised. I checked the job listing on my phone out of reflex, forgetting again that I hadn't had a useful signal since arrival. My stomach sank anyway. Ainsley didn't say "I told you so." She just waited. Why was I approved before they posted the job? I asked. Her answer came too quickly. Because they knew they'd need you. Need. Not might. Not hoped. That tightened something ugly in my chest. Loop 3 had stopped being suspicion and become design. We finished refueling before dusk. Then I watched her do something I couldn't fit into any ordinary logistics explanation. She loaded 2 sealed fuel drums onto the sled behind the tug, drove them past the mapped hangar perimeter toward a patch of empty ground near the north side of the field, and set them down beside what looked, for half a second, like the rusted wall of a building that shouldn't have been there. I blinked. The shape flattened into darkness and blowing snow. When she came back, I asked what she was doing. "Leaving what was asked for," she said. "By who?" She tightened a cargo strap and didn't look at me. Don't call every arrangement superstition just because you weren't present when it became necessary. I followed her gaze out through the storm. There was nothing by the north perimeter except drifted ground and a line of old snow fence half swallowed by white. The next morning the fuel drums were gone. So was the patch of half-seen structure. The snow around the spot lay smooth and untouched. No sled tracks. No boot prints. No sign that anything had ever rested there at all. That disturbed me more than the disappearance itself. Vanishing was almost easier to think about than removal without disturbance. It implied an exchange I couldn't diagram. When I confronted Ainsley over the radio before she cleared the region, she only said, "If you start seeing extra hangars, don't assume they're empty. And if you ever think the place is asking for something, choose the cheapest thing you can spare." Then she signed off. That line lived with me for months. Told me two things at once. First, that she knew the site behaved like a participant, not a backdrop. Second, that she'd been negotiating with it for years and was still alive only because she understood the value of small losses. Grief had already entered her competence. I just didn't recognize it yet. After Ainsley left, I spent 2 days trying to prove I was dealing with linked Arctic phenomena rather than anything impossible. Temperature inversion, electromagnetic interference, mirages over frozen terrain, GPS multipath, solar activity, stress. There was comfort in having a vocabulary, even if the words were only paper walls. I built myself a false explanation because I needed one. The weather cooperated. Conditions stabilized. The silence episodes stopped for nearly a full day. The runway returned to its normal proportions, or at least to a version of them I could tolerate. Radio traffic sounded mundane again. Routine relays and clipped updates from aircraft passing far south of us. I caught myself feeling embarrassed by how ready I'd been to mythologize a neglected site in bad country. That feeling lasted until the cargo aircraft landed. It happened just after twilight. I was in the tower reviewing a wind shift entry when the landing beacon activated on its own, same as it had during the cold open, and the radar remained clean. No transponder, no approach call, no return at all. Just the lights, the signal, and then the low shape of a transport aircraft settling out of darkness onto the runway with its gear kissing the surface like it had done this 100 times. Henry's third rule came back immediately. If an aircraft lands without appearing on radar, do not approach it. I stayed in the tower. The plane rolled to a stop near the far apron, not close enough for good visual detail. Its engine note was wrong, or maybe absent in a way that left a pressure in the ears where sound should have been. Through binoculars I could make out a dull cargo fuselage, old paint, no readable marking from that distance. Cabin lights glowed behind the cockpit glass. No beacon flash, no door opening, no movement on the apron. It just sat there. I radioed standard ground advisory out of habit and heard my own voice come back a half-second late, stretched and thin. No reply. Snow began falling lightly. I kept the binoculars on the aircraft for more than an hour. Nobody disembarked. Nobody crossed the apron. The lights inside the cockpit didn't change. Once I thought I saw a shape turn in the side window, but the reflection from the tower glass made certainty impossible. I did not approach it. That was the right decision. I knew that even before morning proved it. At first light, the aircraft was gone. No tire marks on the apron. No fuel spill. No wind-blown trace of a parked machine. The snow should have preserved something, even a disturbed patch where heat from the engines had melted and refrozen the surface. Instead, I found fresh vehicle tracks leading away from where the plane had stood. They came off the apron in 2 parallel lines, cut across the hard pack beyond the service lane, and continued north toward open tundra. There were no matching inbound tracks. Nothing had driven to the aircraft. Something had driven away from it. I followed them on foot until they reached the same area where Ainsley had left the fuel drums. Then the tracks passed over ground that looked smooth and untouched and simply kept going into nothing my eyes could hold steady. I didn't continue. The smell of wet stone was so strong there it made the back of my throat ache. Static snapped from my glove to the metal clip on my jacket. The air felt crowded, not with bodies but with overlapping distance, as if several directions had been folded into the same place and my senses were trying not to choose between them. That was when I finally understood why Henri hadn't written explanations beside the rules. He'd known explanation would tempt the next man to test it. A rule told you what to survive. The theory made you curious. Still, I wanted the theory. When Ainsley returned on the next supply cycle, I asked for the truth as if truth were a thing she could simply unpack from the cargo hold with the food and spare filters. She didn't answer at once. We stood beside the wing while fine snow brushed the aluminum in a dry whisper. Her face looked older than I remembered from only days before. Finally she said, "You were trying to turn this place into a problem you could solve. It isn't. It's a boundary condition." That wasn't enough, and she knew it. So she brought old navigation maps out of her flight bag, folded copies with grease pencil marks layered over routes that no longer matched current aviation charts. She spread them on the tower desk beneath the weak lamp. Whole sections of northern Canada had been circled, crossed out, and dated in a hand that wasn't Henry's. Some routes ended in notes like "unreliable at winter dark," "approach repeats," "visual misalignment," and "no return beacon after midnight." A few remote strips had arrows connecting them in loops that made no geographic sense. Distances between known points changed from one map to the next by amounts too large to be clerical error. "These aren't official," I said. "They're accurate," she replied. She pointed to our airfield, then to 3 other marked sites scattered across the far north. "They use places like this as references. Lights, towers, beacons. Anything that holds position strongly enough to keep other things from wandering." "Who does?" She gave me a tired look. "Does it matter if they built around something older than they are?" That was the first real glimpse I got of the hidden world beneath the job. Not creatures, not curses, systems, accommodation, infrastructure laid over a landscape whose deeper behavior was known to somebody long before I arrived with my tool bag and contract packet. The airfield wasn't merely remote. It was deliberate. Ainsley told me Henri had understood that before most caretakers did. He'd started asking for survey archives, foundation diagrams, older weather logs. He'd noticed patterns in impossible wind shifts and time loss. He'd begun mapping when the runway lengthened and when radio voices crossed from places they shouldn't. During a major alignment event the previous winter, he'd gone beyond Marker 7. She didn't say he broke. She didn't say he got lost. She said, "He crossed during a bad one, and after that he kept talking from somewhere I couldn't reach." The distinction mattered. "Is he alive?" I asked. Her silence lasted long enough to answer in the worst possible way. "Nod if you've heard him," she said instead. I nodded. So had I. The tower heater clicked. Outside, the sky deepened toward evening. I could feel static building on my forearms before any visible weather change. Ainsley leaned over the maps and tapped the runway symbol with one blunt finger. "This was never transportation infrastructure. That's the lie that gets it funded. It's navigational infrastructure for the region itself. The runway lights, the beacon, the weather logging, the clock. They're not just for pilots. They keep this location behaving like itself long enough for the rest around it to stay lined up." I wanted to reject that with something technical. I wanted to demand documentation, agency names, data. Instead I heard myself ask, "What happens if it drifts?" Her answer came in a voice so level it made the words worse. "Places stop agreeing where they are." That should have sounded abstract. Didn't. By then I'd already seen stretched footprint intervals, disappearing tracks, aircraft without radar returns, and an extension of runway that led into structures the map refused to own. She told me several caretakers had disappeared over the years. Not eaten. Not buried under snow. Not found at the bottom of ravines. They crossed into adjacent layers of the same region during active shifts, usually while doing exactly what trained men did when a system behaved wrong. They inspected. They verified. They approached. Henri had simply gotten farther than most. Before she left, she gave me one more truth that explained too much and not enough. Local hires refused the site. Experienced Arctic staff found reasons not to return. Outsiders kept getting approved quickly because outsiders still believed the job description. That was Loop 3 closed in the ugliest way. I hadn't been chosen in spite of my lack of Arctic experience. I'd been chosen because of it. The severe geomagnetic storm arrived 3 nights later. I knew it was coming from the forecasts first, then from the way the site itself reacted before the sky changed. The static started at sunset and never let up. Every time I touched a handrail, a door latch, a radio knob, a blue snap bit through my glove. The smell of wet stone seeped up from the frozen ground so thickly that even inside the tower I could taste mineral damp over dust and fuel. The clocks all drifted another 4 minutes without agreement on when they'd done it. And then the northern lights appeared beneath the horizon. I don't mean reflected. I don't mean a trick of cloud or a low band over distant terrain. Green light moved under the line where land met sky, rippling from below as if the earth had become translucent and something vast was breathing inside it. Henry's seventh rule had been plain. If the northern lights appear beneath the horizon, leave the airfield immediately. I should have run to the plane bay and prayed Ainsley was close enough to answer a blind emergency call. Instead, the emergency signal panel on the tower console lit up in a sequence I hadn't seen before. The far runway markers activated one after another. The impossible ones. Past 7. Beyond the mapped end. A transmission broke through the static. "Callum," Henri said, clear as if he stood one room away. "If the anchor loses the west line, the towers stop matching. You can't let the clock room go dark." This time I keyed the mic before I could stop myself. "Where are you?" Faint breath. Then, "Still at the airfield." That answer ruined the last of my old assumptions. I left the tower with a portable radio, cold gear, and the emergency light wand I didn't really need. The wind hit me sideways, except it wasn't wind everywhere. Patches of the apron stood in impossible stillness while other sections hissed under driven snow. My boots crunched over frozen grit, then over softer ground where no thaw should have been. Beyond marker 7 the runway lights blazed with full current, brighter than any part of the documented strip. I crossed 7. The world did not change all at once. That would have been easier. Instead it accumulated layer by layer until ordinary perspective lost the argument. The runway extended under my feet in overlapping surfaces. One lane was cracked asphalt. Another, half a step to the side, looked newer, darker, freshly painted. A third shimmered beneath both, rough gravel under old floodlights. My flashlight beam struck a hangar wall to the left and kept going through a second hangar wall behind it, each at a different angle, as though multiple versions of the airfield had been laid across one another with imperfect registration. There were towers. More than one. One stood where mine should have been, yellow light in the upper windows and frost on the glass. Another leaned slightly, dark for years by the look of it, antenna bent, paint peeled raw by weather I couldn't place. Farther out I saw a squat beacon tower rotating with a slow mechanical patience beside a runway much wider than ours, lined with blue edge lights instead of white. Beyond that, impossibly distant and impossibly near, an apron full of aircraft silhouettes waited beneath sodium lamps in a snowless night. The place didn't extend outward so much as sideways through itself. That was the maximum truth of it, though I didn't have the language until later. The airfield beyond marker 7 was not a hidden annex or buried installation. It was a stack of aligned and misaligned locations occupying related space. Adjacent layers. Repeated anchors. The same fixed point holding open multiple versions of surrounding geography whenever the anomaly expanded with seasonal darkness and geomagnetic strain. The Arctic wasn't simply empty. In certain conditions, it became plural. Henry's voice kept guiding me in fragments. Left side tower won't hold. Go lower. Watch the cables. Don't trust the doors that are already open. I moved through a corridor between two hangars that couldn't both exist. The air shifted temperature every few steps. One doorway breathed freezer cold. The next exhaled damp, cave-like air that smelled of stone after rain. My skin crackled with charge. Now and then the silence slammed down for a few seconds, cutting out even my own footfalls, and in those moments the overlapping structures seemed to lean closer, as if sound itself usually kept them politely apart. I found the clock room below a tower that matched ours only in outline. Inside, old relay cabinets hummed beside newer digital panels, both somehow feeding the same banks of runway circuits through cable runs that vanished into concrete older than the building above them. On one wall hung weather logs in several hands, decades apart. Different forms, different ink. Same site name, came together there, not as panic but as terrible professional clarity. The longer runway had not been a delusion. It was a temporary exposure of adjacent anchor geometry. The radarless aircraft had not appeared from nowhere. They had crossed from neighboring layers where the runway also existed and landed on a strip only some instruments could agree on. The control tower clock gaining time wasn't a defect. It marked local slippage, the airfield's internal systems advancing out of step to keep the anchor synchronized with other versions of itself. The impossible weather entries Henri had insisted on recording weren't symptoms. They were measurements of alignment. And the airfield itself had never been built primarily to support aircraft. Aircraft used it, yes. Supply runs came and went. Emergency routes justified budgets. But beneath that practical surface, the site existed to hold a point in place while the surrounding region periodically ceased obeying ordinary distance. Reality needed runway lights. That sounds insane even now. It sounded worse when I first understood it. Yet all the evidence I'd resisted snapped into one picture so precise it made my old skepticism feel childish. The hidden world wasn't hiding in caves or bodies or folklore. It was hiding in maintenance schedules, reference beacons, weather logs, and the quiet decisions made by tired professionals who had learned how much geography could move if nobody kept watch. Then I saw Henri. Not clearly, not all at once. He moved through the windowed corridor of another tower running parallel to mine, one layer over. Heavy parka, head bare, face pale in instrument light. He looked older than the photos on his ID card by a handful of hard years, but alive in the blunt practical sense that mattered. He was working, writing something down, reaching to reset a breaker. He looked up as if he felt me looking. For a moment our towers aligned well enough that I thought I could cross to him. Then the floor plan shifted and the corridor between us became a hangar wall, then open runway, then black distance filled with moving green light below the horizon. His voice came over the radio instead. "Don't follow me. That's how they keep replacing us." That was Trigger 2 in its final form. Inevitability. Every rule in the notebook had not been written to save Henri. They had been written to prepare the next caretaker for the shape of his own succession. I kept the West Line active through the storm by doing what I knew how to do. Resetting breakers, rerouting load between lighting banks, hand cranking a jammed beacon motor where power stuttered between cabinets from different decades. Competence still mattered there. That was the cruel mercy of it. The impossible didn't erase the job. It only revealed the job beneath the job. Ainsley's aircraft called in once through heavy static, circling outside whatever edge she refused to cross. She couldn't land. The strip wasn't holding stable enough on her instruments. Her voice stayed steady anyway. "You understand it now?" she asked. "Enough," I said. "Then you know somebody has to stay with the anchor until it settles." I did know. The systems were daisy-chained across layers. When one tower darkened, another took the load, but only if someone there kept it fed, logged, corrected, and aligned. Henri had not vanished from his post. He had remained at it in another version of the same place, trapped not by chains or monsters but by ongoing function. The cycle didn't devour people. It retained caretakers. A replacement wasn't a sacrifice in the ceremonial sense. It was a staffing transition the universe had learned to outsource. The storm worsened. Green light pulsed beneath the land and above it at once. Towers overlapped, separated, and overlapped again. I saw abandoned versions of the field with snow pushed against hangar doors no human had touched for decades. I saw one layer where the runway lights burned amber over bare gravel under a summer sky that could not have belonged to the same night. I heard weather reports in Henry's voice from directions the radio had no right to locate. The last maintenance cycle came down to a choice so mechanical it almost offended me. If I retreated to the original tower and let the West Line fail, the site might slip far enough out of alignment to take the surrounding reference with it. Routes would degrade. Distances would stop agreeing. Whatever sections of the region depended on this anchor would wander. Maybe planes would miss strips. Maybe search corridors would fold. Maybe whole mapped approaches would become lies. If I stayed where the towers still touched, kept the shared systems running through peak activity, and accepted that the route back might not remain where I left it, the anchor would hold. Ainsley didn't ask me to volunteer. That was the last kindness she had. She only said, "If you stay, Leave the notebook where the next one can find it. Don't write explanations. Just write what keeps him alive. So I did. I copied Henry's 7 rules into a clean notebook in my own hand. I added one line at the front. Your replacement will need this more than management ever will. Then I sent it back on the last stable sled transfer Ainsley could make when a corridor between layers briefly matched the original hangar apron. I watched her take it with an expression that held no surprise at all. Only grief. Old grief. Practiced grief. The kind you got from surviving the same bargain too many times. After that, the route behind me changed. I knew the original tower by every sound it made, but I never found its exact stairs again. Some versions came close. One had my tools laid out on the desk exactly as I'd left them, except the frost pattern on the windows was wrong and the wall clock lagged instead of lead. Another held the smell of fresh coffee, though there was none. In one layer I heard my own footsteps overhead before I took them. None of those towers was mine in the useful sense. Henri kept transmitting, sometimes from one runway over, sometimes from what felt like years away. We never learned whether the overlapping airfields led somewhere beyond themselves or whether they simply nested outward forever, each maintained by the people who crossed too far trying to keep the others stable. Months later, during a calm stretch when the layers aligned just enough for sight but not passage, I saw Ainsley deliver supplies to the newest caretaker at the original field. He moved like I had on my first day, shoulders still set in the clean angles of ordinary contract work. She left the notebook on the desk and said something I couldn't hear through the mismatch in distance. Then she walked back to her aircraft without looking toward my tower, though I had the feeling she knew exactly where I was standing. When her plane departed, the radio in my room crackled and settled into the shared weather channel. Henri gave the ceiling estimate first. Then I gave the wind. I had started checking the horizon every time the silence fell, not above it but below, where the ground sometimes tried to remember it could glow. And even after all that time, I still couldn't tell whether Henri was ahead of me, behind me, or only one runway over.